Right now, without moving, you are being chemically taken apart by the most common metal on Earth, and you have no idea it is happening. Pick up your keys, or grab the nearest metal railing, or just press your fingers against any steel surface for a few seconds. Now bring your hand to your face and take a slow breath in. You know that smell. Sharp, cold, a little unsettling. That faint metallic bite that seems to come straight from the object itself. We all know it. We have known it our whole lives. We grew up calling it the smell of metal. We say it so casually, like it is just a background fact of the world, like the smell of rain or fresh bread. But here is where the floor drops out from under you. Metal does not have a smell, not even slightly. Iron atoms at room temperature produce no volatile compounds whatsoever. Nothing leaves the surface of that coin or that railing and travels through the air to reach your nose. The metal itself is completely odorless. It always has been. So what are you actually smelling right now? The answer is you. You are smelling yourself. Specifically, you are smelling your own skin being broken down at the molecular level in real time, triggered the instant your body made contact with that surface. Think about that for a second. You touch something, and your body immediately starts coming apart, and the proof of that is the smell you just inhaled. And this has been happening every single time you have touched metal your entire life. Every door handle, every coin, every railing on every staircase. Every time you thought you were just touching an object, your body was quietly registering something much more serious. The cold feeling you get from metal, the slight sense of wrongness. That is not your imagination. That is not a personality quirk or irrational sensitivity. That is your nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do, picking up a signal and flagging it. And the signal is real. The chemistry behind it is real. Your instincts about this specific element are not just accurate, they are ancient. They run deeper than conscious thought. And as you are about to find out, they are connected to something so much larger than a handful of coins that it will genuinely change the way you think about the world around you. But before we get there, before we go deeper, I want you to sit with that image for a moment. The smell you have trusted your whole life as a simple sensory fact. The smell you pointed to as a child and said, "That is what metal smells like," was never the metal at all. It was always you. It was always your own chemistry reacting, your own body sending up a warning signal that you never quite translated correctly. And the reason your body reacts at all, the reason this early warning system exists, goes back to a decision made so long ago that it predates the existence of anything we would recognize as an animal. It was a gamble. A specific, calculated, almost reckless gamble that your ancestors made on your behalf. And you are still paying the cost of it today. If any of this is already shifting something in the way you think, drop a like on this video and subscribe, because we are only at the very beginning, and where this goes next is going to hit a lot harder. Now, here is what actually happens at the chemical level, and I want you to stay with me on this because it matters more than it might seem at first. The moment your skin makes contact with a metal surface, the fats that naturally coat your hand do not just sit there passively. Iron acts as a catalyst, meaning it speeds up chemical reactions without being consumed by them. It throws itself into the lipid layer of your skin and starts pulling it apart, breaking those fat molecules down into smaller compounds, specifically a group called aldehydes and ketones. These are volatile. These are what float off the surface and reach your nose. These are the smell. You are not detecting the object, you are detecting the wreckage. And your body knows this. Not in any conscious way, not in a way that produces a clear thought or a memory or a word. But somewhere, underneath all of that, at a level that operates before language or reason even gets involved, your body registers contact with this element and immediately starts broadcasting a chemical alarm. The increased alertness you feel around the smell of metal, the slight tension, the sense that something requires your attention. None of that is accidental. All of it is wired into you at a level so deep it predates the entire history of your species. What I find genuinely unsettling about this is not the chemistry itself. The chemistry is fascinating, but it is not what keeps me turning this over in my mind. What gets me is the scale of how long this has been happening without any of us noticing what it actually means. Every time you smelled metal and thought nothing of it, your body was running a reaction that your ancestors encoded into your biology for a very specific reason. And that reason connects directly to a choice made hundreds of millions of years ago, deep in evolutionary history. A choice between two completely different ways of staying alive. One path was cautious, stable, and slow. The other was powerful, efficient, and loaded with risk. Your ancestors did not choose the cautious path, and the full weight of that decision, what it gave us and what it cost us, is something most people never stop to think about. But once you understand it, once you really see what was traded and what was kept, the smell on your fingers stops being a minor curiosity and starts being something that feels almost like a message. A very old message, sent forward through time in the only language biology knows how to use. And the next part of that message is the part that genuinely changes everything. Your body chose to carry a toxin in its bloodstream, and it made that choice before anything resembling a human being ever existed on this planet. That is not a metaphor. That is not poetic language. That is the literal biological reality of what happened, and the more you understand it, the stranger it gets. Let me take you back to something. Not a place you can visit or a moment anyone recorded. This is deeper than that. Imagine the ocean, hundreds of millions of years ago. Not the ocean as a dramatic backdrop, but as a chemical problem. Early life had a fundamental challenge. Cells needed energy, lots of it. And the most efficient way to generate energy at a cellular level requires moving oxygen around, getting it from one place to another quickly and reliably. But oxygen does not dissolve well in water. It does not move easily through fluid on its own. Life needed a transport system, and nature, the way it always does, started running experiments. Some of those experiments survive today. Squid run on copper. Certain spiders run on copper. A wide range of shellfish and mollusks built their entire circulatory chemistry around a copper-based protein called hemocyanin. If you have ever seen the pale blue color inside a freshly opened shellfish, that is what copper-based blood actually looks like. It works. It is stable. It is not particularly aggressive or reactive. It keeps the organism alive without creating too much internal chemical tension. The ancestors of vertebrates, the line that eventually became fish and then amphibians and then reptiles and then mammals and then us, they tried copper too. And at some point, something shifted. A mutation, a pressure, a survival advantage that tipped the scales. They moved to iron. They built hemoglobin, a protein structure with a single iron atom locked at its center, and that iron atom turned out to be extraordinarily good at one specific thing. It grabbed oxygen with an almost aggressive efficiency that copper simply could not match. The difference in performance is not small. Iron-based oxygen transport is dramatically more effective than copper-based at the temperatures and pressures that warm-blooded animals operate at. It is the reason your muscles can sustain intense effort. It is the reason your brain runs hot enough to do what it does. It is the reason the vertebrate line eventually produced organisms fast enough, strong enough, and cognitively complex enough to crawl out of the ocean, cross continents, build cities, and sit here listening to a video about the chemistry of a coin. But there is a price. There is always a price. The same property that makes iron so effective as an oxygen carrier, that aggressive reactivity, that almost desperate chemical grab, makes it extraordinarily dangerous when it gets out of its container. And the container it lives in is not permanent. Red blood cells age. Proteins degrade. The molecular cages that hold iron atoms in place throughout your circulatory system are constantly being maintained, repaired, replaced. Your body runs an entire parallel operation, invisible and continuous, whose sole purpose is making sure iron never gets loose. And here is what makes that so strange to think about. Evolution looked at this situation, at the danger, at the cost, at the constant maintenance required, and it chose iron anyway. It looked at copper, stable and safe and slow, and it said, that is not enough. It looked at iron, reactive and dangerous and hard to control, and it said, yes, that one. We will build around that one. We are the result of that bet. The warmth of your body right now, the speed at which you can think, the fact that your heart can sustain the output it does, all of that traces back to the moment evolution decided that the danger was worth the power. And the reason that decision still matters today, the reason it is not just an interesting historical footnote about ancient biology, is that the consequences of that choice are still running inside you right now, in real time, as you listen to this. So let me tell you about the number, because the number is where it gets genuinely unsettling. The total amount of iron in an average adult human body is about 4 grams. If you have ever held a medium-sized nail between your fingers, that is roughly the weight we are talking about. It is almost nothing. It is a quantity so small you could lose it in the pocket of a jacket and forget it was there. And that 4 grams is currently distributed across your entire circulatory system, carried inside tens of trillions of individual red blood cells, each one a pressurized molecular container engineered to keep its iron payload locked down and controlled. The scale of that operation is almost impossible to picture. Tens of trillions of containers, all running simultaneously, all dependent on protein structures that have to be constantly renewed, and every single one of them holding something that, if it escapes, starts doing serious damage immediately. This is not a backup system with room for error. This is a live operation running at the edge of its tolerances every moment you are alive. And it works, most of the time, in the same way that a structure under constant stress works. Not because the stress is gone, but because the engineering is just barely good enough to hold. Just barely. And what happens in the moments when it is not quite good enough is something that changes how you look at the word breathing entirely. Every single breath you take is slowly damaging you, and iron is the reason why. Not in a vague, abstract, everything causes harm kind of way, in a specific, measurable, molecular way that researchers can observe directly under a microscope. And the mechanism behind it is so clean and so ruthless that once you understand it, the word breathing never quite feels the same again. Here is what happens. Your cells produce energy by burning oxygen. That process is not perfectly clean. As a byproduct, small amounts of hydrogen peroxide get generated inside your tissues constantly, just as a natural consequence of your metabolism running. Under normal circumstances, your body handles this without any drama. There are enzymes specifically designed to break hydrogen peroxide down before it causes problems. The system works. But then introduce a free iron atom into that environment. Iron that has escaped from its protein housing and is moving loose through the cellular fluid, and everything changes. Free iron reacts with hydrogen peroxide and produces something called a hydroxyl radical. The name sounds technical, but the behavior is straightforward. A hydroxyl radical is a molecule so chemically aggressive that it reacts with almost anything it touches, instantly, without discrimination. It does not recognize the difference between a bacterial cell and your own DNA. It does not pause. It does not select targets. It just reacts, and whatever it reacts with gets structurally damaged. Cellular membranes get torn open. Proteins get twisted out of their functional shapes. Genetic material gets fragmented, and each free iron atom can trigger this reaction over and over again because iron is a catalyst. It drives the reaction without being used up by it. This is not a rare or exotic process. This is something your body is actively managing right now, in this moment, as you sit here. The reason it does not spiral out of control is that your biology has built an entire containment architecture around iron specifically to prevent free iron from existing at all. There are specialized proteins whose only job is to intercept iron atoms and lock them down before they can cause this kind of damage. There are dedicated storage molecules that function like molecular safes, holding iron reserves in a form that cannot react with anything. Your liver, your spleen, your bone marrow, all of them participate in this constant low-level operation that most people never think about for a single second of their lives. And here is the thing that really gets me about all of this. The same iron atom that is useful, the one locked inside hemoglobin doing exactly what evolution designed it to do, and the free iron atom that is actively destructive, those are not two different substances. They are the same atom in two different situations. The only difference is the container. Take away the protein cage and the oxygen carrier becomes the cellular wrecker. The tool becomes the threat. The same property that makes it so effective at grabbing oxygen is precisely what makes it so damaging when it gets loose. We are not carrying a helpful mineral in our blood. We are carrying a controlled hazard, kept functional by a biological containment system that runs continuously from the moment you are born until the moment you die. And when that system gets disrupted, when disease or injury or simple cellular aging degrades the containment structures, the damage is real and measurable and serious. Your body has known this all along. That alarm signal we talked about at the very beginning, the chemical distress response triggered by skin contact with metal, it is not a quirk. It is the surface expression of a much deeper biological wariness that is woven into every layer of your physiology. Your skin reacts. Your immune system reacts. Your liver reacts. Every system that interacts with iron treats it as something to be managed, contained, and watched. Not as a nutrient, as a necessary risk. Now hold that thought, because here is where the story takes a turn that most people never see coming. Everything I just described, the danger, the containment architecture, the biological wariness, all of it assumes that iron is powerful, reactive, formidable. It assumes the metal itself earns the caution we give it. But what if I told you that iron, on its own, in its pure form, is one of the weakest structural materials you will ever encounter? What if the entire reputation of this element, the thing that made civilizations built around it and armies march for it, is based on a property that iron does not actually possess by itself? Go find a piece of perfectly pure iron. Not steel, not an alloy. Pure iron, refined to remove every contaminant. Hold it in your hands. It is soft. Genuinely, surprisingly soft. You could scratch its surface with a standard kitchen knife. If you applied steady pressure, you could bend a thin rod of it by hand. It ranks a 4 on the standard scale used to measure mineral hardness. For comparison, a piece of ordinary window glass ranks a 5. The glass in your kitchen window is harder than the metal that supposedly built human civilization. A bronze sword, made from the technology that came before the Iron Age, would be objectively harder, hold a sharper edge, and resist wear better than a sword made from pure iron. And yet at some point, humanity abandoned bronze and committed everything to a softer, weaker, more corrosion-prone alternative. The question of why that happened is not a simple one, and the answer, when you actually look at it clearly, reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the nature of progress itself. Because the story we were taught about the Iron Age, the triumphant narrative of human ingenuity discovering a superior material and building a better world, that story is missing the part that actually explains what happened. The real explanation is not about discovery at all. It is about desperation. It is about what people do when the system they depend on collapses and the only option left is to work with whatever is still available. And what was available was everywhere. Literally everywhere. Under the soil, in the cliffs, in the riverbeds. Iron ore is one of the most abundant materials in the Earth's crust. You cannot dig very far in most parts of the world without finding it, which made it the perfect fallback when everything else disappeared. But the full story of why everything else disappeared, and what that collapse actually looked like, is the part that changes everything you think you know about how civilizations rise and fall. The most advanced civilization of the ancient world did not fall because of war. It fell because of a supply chain problem. And the metal that replaced it was objectively worse in almost every measurable way. That is the part of history that gets quietly left out of the version most people learn. The transition to iron was not a leap forward. It was a controlled fall onto the only thing left to land on. To understand it, you have to picture what the world looked like before. The interconnected network of cultures that dominated the ancient Mediterranean and Near East was one of the most sophisticated trading systems humanity had ever built up to that point. Ships moved constantly between ports. Merchants tracked inventories across thousands of miles. Craftsmen in one region depended on raw materials sourced from locations so distant they had never seen them. The whole thing worked the way a complex machine works, every part dependent on every other part, humming along smoothly as long as nothing significant broke. Bronze was the material that held this machine together. And bronze required two things: copper, which was relatively available in several locations, and tin, which was not. Tin deposits that could be mined at scale were rare and geographically concentrated. The tin that fed the bronze industries of the ancient Mediterranean travelled extraordinary distances, passing through multiple hands, crossing sea routes that took weeks to navigate. The entire material foundation of these civilizations rested on a supply chain that was long, complex, and fragile. And then, within roughly 1 generation, it broke. The details of exactly what caused it are still debated among researchers, but the outcome is not. Trade networks collapsed. Ports that had been busy for centuries went silent. Cities that had stood for hundreds of years were abandoned or destroyed. The knowledge of how to efficiently work certain materials was lost in the disruption. And the tin supply, already stretched thin across those long routes, simply stopped arriving. Without tin, you cannot make bronze. And without bronze, you cannot maintain the military, agricultural, and construction infrastructure that these societies depended on. So people did what people always do when the preferred option disappears. They looked at what was still available, and iron ore was everywhere. It was in the ground beneath their feet. It did not need to be imported. It did not require a functioning long-distance trade network to access. It was just there, waiting, in quantities that dwarfed anything else available. The problem was that working with iron properly required temperatures that the furnace technology of the time could not consistently achieve. Early iron smelting produced a porous, inconsistent material that was genuinely difficult to work with and structurally unreliable in ways that bronze simply was not. The craftsmen who tried to build weapons and tools from it were working with something they did not yet fully understand, using techniques adapted from a completely different material, and the results reflected that. There are accounts from this transitional period describing iron blades that bent under the stress of actual use, tools that failed mid-task. The kind of practical unreliability that would have been completely unacceptable in the bronze work that preceded it. Iron in this early form was not a superior technology, it was a substitute, adopted under pressure, that took generations of accumulated craft knowledge to develop into something genuinely competitive. The narrative of human progress loves a clean story. Discovery leads to improvement, leads to a better world. But the actual history of iron does not fit that shape. It fits a different shape entirely, one where catastrophe forces adaptation, where the adaptation is imperfect and costly and built on the ruins of something that worked better, and where the result, over time, becomes so deeply embedded in how the world operates that the original circumstances get forgotten entirely. We ended up with iron not because we sought it out, but because we lost everything else. And the civilization we built on top of it carries that origin in its structure in ways most people never examine. But here is where it gets genuinely strange. Because even acknowledging all of that, even knowing that pure iron is soft and that the transition to it was driven by desperation rather than discovery, the world we eventually built from it is real. The bridges are real. The buildings are real. The engines are real. Something happened between that early unreliable iron and the structural steel holding up the building you are sitting in right now. And what happened is one of the more quietly remarkable things in the history of materials. The transformation did not come from purifying iron further. It did not come from finding a better version of the element or a more refined form of it. It came from doing the opposite. It came from making it dirtier. Not randomly dirtier, not carelessly contaminated, dirtier in a very specific, controlled, deliberate way that changes the fundamental behavior of the metal at the atomic level. And the substance responsible for that transformation is something so ordinary, so familiar, so present in everyday life, that the elegance of it is almost funny. It is carbon. Specifically, small amounts of carbon forced into the crystalline structure of iron under heat and pressure. And what that carbon does when it gets in there is not what most people would expect. Carbon atoms are the right size to slip into the spaces between iron atoms in the crystal lattice, the microscopic geometric arrangement that iron forms when it solidifies. Once they are in those spaces, they act as physical blockers. When stress is applied to the metal and the iron layers try to slide past each other, which is exactly what happens when pure iron bends or deforms, the carbon atoms are in the way. They jam the movement, they prevent the sliding. And that resistance to sliding is, at the most fundamental level, what we call hardness and strength. Steel is not a refined version of iron. Steel is iron that has been strategically contaminated. The entire structural foundation of modern civilization, every beam, every cable, every load-bearing element in every building and bridge and vehicle, exists because someone figured out that introducing the right impurity in the right concentration transforms a soft, unreliable metal into something that can hold up the world. We did not improve iron, we corrupted it on purpose. And that deliberate corruption is the only reason any of this works. But here is the part that keeps pulling at me. If the strength of steel comes entirely from that contamination, from those carbon atoms jamming the structure and preventing movement, then the steel is always in a kind of internal tension. The iron wants to move. The carbon is blocking it. That stress does not disappear. It does not resolve. It just sits there, locked into the material for as long as the structure exists. And iron, it turns out, has a very specific and very patient response to that kind of tension. Every star in the sky is going to be murdered by iron, and the process has already started in most of them. Not by collision, not by some external force arriving from outside, from the inside, from their own core, slowly, inevitably, as a direct consequence of the same nuclear physics that makes iron so stable inside your blood cells. The connection between the hemoglobin in your veins and the death of a star is not a metaphor. It is the same property of the same element operating at two completely different scales, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. We left off with steel under tension, iron straining against the carbon atoms blocking its movement, the whole structure locked in a kind of permanent internal standoff. Hold that image. Because what happens inside a massive star in the final phase of its life is structurally the same situation played out at a scale that makes the largest steel structure humanity has ever built look like a dust particle. A star is not burning in the way a candle burns. There is no flame, no oxygen being consumed from the outside. What a star is doing is running a nuclear fusion reaction in its core, forcing atomic nuclei together under pressures and temperatures so extreme that the nuclei merge and form heavier elements. When lighter nuclei fuse into heavier ones, the resulting nucleus has slightly less mass than the sum of its parts. That missing mass gets converted directly into energy. That energy is what you see when you look at a star. That energy is also what pushes outward against the star's own gravity, maintaining the balance that keeps the whole structure from collapsing. This process runs in stages. A massive star starts with hydrogen, fusing it into helium for millions of years. When the hydrogen in the core runs out, the core contracts, temperatures rise, and helium starts fusing into carbon. That phase lasts much shorter. Then carbon fuses into heavier elements, and each subsequent stage runs faster and hotter than the one before. Neon, magnesium, oxygen, silicon, each one burning through its fuel in less time than the last, the star consuming its own reserves at an accelerating pace. And through all of this, the star is essentially doing what your body does with iron. It is running a controlled, increasingly strained operation, extracting energy at each stage to maintain the pressure that keeps it from collapsing, constantly managing the tension between what it produces and what gravity demands. Then it reaches silicon, and silicon fuses into iron. The star does not know what it has done. There is no moment of awareness. But the physics of what happens next is as close to inevitable as anything in the universe gets. Because iron, that same element whose stability makes it the endpoint of your body's energy calculations, is also the endpoint of a star's energy calculations. Fusing iron does not release energy, it absorbs it. Every previous fusion reaction paid the star in energy. Iron sends the bill. The core, which has been producing energy continuously for millions of years, suddenly stops. Not gradually. The transition is brutally fast by stellar standards. The pressure holding the star's outer layers away from the center disappears. And what happens when you remove the structural support from something with the mass of a sun is not a slow deflation. It is a catastrophic, near instantaneous collapse. The outer layers of the star, which have been held up by the pressure from the core, begin to fall inward. Not drift, fall, accelerating towards the center at a significant fraction of the speed of light, hundreds of thousands of kilometers per second. The scale of matter in motion here is genuinely impossible to hold in your head. We are talking about a quantity of material that dwarfs entire planets, falling inward in a matter of seconds. When that infalling material hits the collapsed core, which has been compressed to nuclear density, it rebounds. The shock wave that travels outward from that rebound is the most energetic event that occurs in the observable universe on a regular basis. It tears the star apart from the inside. It flings material across light years of space. For a brief period, a single exploding star can outshine an entire galaxy containing hundreds of billions of other stars. That is a supernova. And iron is the trigger. Iron is always the trigger. Now here is where this connects back to you in a way that should feel genuinely strange the first time you really sit with it. All that material flung outward by the explosion, the shock wave carrying heavier elements synthesized in the final seconds of the star's life, that debris does not just disappear into empty space. It travels, it spreads, it mixes with clouds of gas and dust already present in the galaxy, and over millions of years, gravity pulls those clouds together, condensing them into new structures, new star systems, new planets, oceans, continents. Eventually, the right conditions for chemistry complex enough to be called life. The iron in your blood did not come from Earth's crust. It came from space. It was forged in the core of a star that no longer exists, expelled in the explosion that ended that star's life, scattered across the galaxy, eventually swept up into the material that formed our solar system, incorporated into the planet, cycled through geological processes, absorbed into the ocean, integrated into the earliest living chemistry, and passed forward through billions of years of biological evolution until it ended up locked inside a hemoglobin molecule inside a red blood cell inside your circulatory system right now. You are not made of stardust in the loose, poetic way that phrase usually gets used. You are made of the specific nuclear byproduct that ended a stellar life. The iron running through your veins is the ash of a fire that burned for millions of years and then destroyed everything that contained it. Think about what that actually means. The thing that makes your blood red, the thing that lets your lungs deliver oxygen to your brain so you can think these thoughts right now, is the same thing that shut down a star. The same stability that makes iron so valuable inside hemoglobin is the same stability that makes it a dead end inside a stellar core. One context, it sustains life. Another context, it ends it on an astronomical scale. And this is not a coincidence or a poetic parallel. It is the same atom, operating according to the same nuclear physics in two different environments. Iron does not care which environment it is in. It behaves according to its nature regardless. Its nature happens to be simultaneously essential and terminal, depending entirely on the scale and context you are looking at. What that means for the long-term future of everything, not just stars, not just biology, but the entire universe and every atom in it, is the part that most people never hear. And it starts with understanding something about iron that goes deeper than chemistry or biology or even stellar physics. It starts with understanding what iron actually is in the language of energy itself. Every single atom in the universe is slowly losing a race, and iron is the finish line. Not a metaphor, not a philosophical position. A direct consequence of how atomic nuclei work, measured in laboratories, confirmed by multiple independent lines of physics, and so consistently supported by the evidence that the scientific community treats it not as a theory, but as a mathematical certainty. Everything is moving toward iron. Everything has always been moving toward iron. The only variable is time, and the universe has more of that than the human mind can meaningfully process. We established in the last section that iron kills stars. That its stability is what makes it a dead end for stellar fusion. That the moment a star's core produces iron, it loses the ability to sustain the pressure holding it together. But that framing, while accurate, is actually too small. It treats iron as a problem specific to stars, as a trap that massive burning objects fall into. The reality is wider and stranger than that. Think about what energy actually means at the level of an atomic nucleus. Every nucleus in existence, every proton and neutron arrangement in every element on the periodic table sits at a specific energy level. Some sit high, like hydrogen, with enormous potential energy stored in their structure, ready to release it through fusion. Some sit lower, like uranium, unstable in a different direction, tending to shed pieces of themselves through radioactive decay. All of them are sitting at some elevation in what physicists call the nuclear binding energy landscape, a kind of terrain map where height represents stored energy and depth represents stability. Iron 56 sits at the very bottom of that landscape. It is the deepest valley in the entire map. Its nucleus is packed more tightly, more efficiently than any other combination of protons and neutrons that exists. There is no rearrangement of its components that would release energy. There is nothing left to optimize. It has already reached the configuration that requires the least energy to maintain, and it will stay there indefinitely without doing anything at all. Every other element is sitting uphill from iron in one direction or another. Hydrogen is far uphill on one side, wanting to roll down through fusion. Uranium is far uphill on the other side, wanting to roll down through decay. Everything in between is at some intermediate elevation, higher than iron, subject to the same gravitational pull of thermodynamics toward that lowest point. Given enough time and enough available pathways, everything rolls downhill. That is not a poetic statement. It is a description of physical law. And the destination at the bottom of every possible downhill path is the same element we have been talking about since the beginning of this story. The universe is not expanding into some undefined future of endless possibility. It is draining. It is running downhill toward a specific chemical destination that was determined by nuclear physics before the first star ever formed. We are living in the middle of that process, in the phase where there is still enough variety, still enough elements sitting high enough on the energy landscape to do interesting things, to form planets and oceans and living organisms and cities and conversations about iron. But the direction of travel is fixed. It has always been fixed. Now take that understanding and bring it back to Earth. Because there is a place on this planet where the consequences of iron's gravitational pull on the energy landscape are playing out right now, in real time, at a scale that affects every living thing on the surface, and most people walk over it every day without thinking about it once. 3,000 kilometers beneath your feet, give or take, there is a boundary. Above it, solid rock. Below it, liquid metal. The transition is not gradual. It is sharp, a phase boundary where the material properties change abruptly, where the solid mantle ends and the outer core begins. And the outer core is not a static reservoir of liquid iron sitting quietly in the dark. It is moving. Constantly, chaotically, driven by the heat still leaking outward from the inner core and by the rotation of the planet itself. Those movements generate electrical currents. The currents generate a magnetic field. The field extends far out into space, creating an invisible structure around the planet that deflects the continuous stream of charged particles flowing outward from the Sun. Without that field, those particles would reach the upper atmosphere directly. Over geological time, they would strip it away, layer by layer, the way wind erodes a sand dune, just incomparably faster. The air you are breathing right now exists because liquid iron is moving in the dark 3,000 kilometers below you. The pressure you feel in your lungs, the temperature of the air, the fact that there is an atmosphere here at all of it traces back to the same element that kills stars, that your body contains and fears, that civilizations built themselves around without fully understanding. And the evidence for what happens when this system fails is not theoretical. It is right there in the sky on any clear night, visible to the naked eye, a small, reddish point of light that serves as the most accessible case study in planetary catastrophe available to us. That planet had oceans once, liquid water on the surface, a substantial atmosphere, conditions that researchers increasingly believe were compatible with the development of simple life forms. It had all of this because it had what Earth has, a molten iron core generating a magnetic field strong enough to hold an atmosphere against the solar wind. But that planet is smaller than Earth. Its iron core had less volume, less thermal mass, less capacity to retain the heat that keeps the liquid metal churning. It cooled faster than ours did. And as the core cooled, the motion of the liquid iron slowed. The electrical currents weakened. The magnetic field thinned, flickered, and eventually collapsed. What came next took millions of years, but was as inevitable as anything physics produces. The solar wind reached the atmosphere directly. The lighter gases escaped first, then the heavier ones, the process accelerating as the atmospheric pressure dropped and temperatures swung to extremes that no liquid water could survive. The oceans evaporated. The surface, once potentially wet and complex, became the dry, frozen, radiation-scoured landscape we observe today. That planet is not a warning about some distant future risk. It is a record of a completed process. It is what happens after the iron core stops doing its job. It is a photograph of the outcome we are currently avoiding, not through any action of our own, but simply because our core has not yet cooled to the point of stillness. And here is what makes that quietly terrifying. The cooling is ongoing. The inner core is growing, adding roughly 1 millimeter of solid iron to its surface every year as the liquid outer core gradually freezes from the inside out. The dynamo that generates our magnetic field depends on the liquid outer core continuing to move. As the outer core slowly solidifies over billions of years, the motion will change, the currents will weaken, and the field will begin to behave differently. We are not in immediate danger. The timescales involved are geological, not human. But the direction of travel is the same direction that the planet next door already completed. Our iron core is doing exactly what that other core did. It is just doing it more slowly. And there is something almost vertiginous about standing on the surface of a planet, breathing its air, living inside the invisible magnetic structure that makes that air possible, knowing that the whole arrangement is temporary. Knowing that it depends on liquid metals staying liquid, on heat that is slowly, continuously, irreversibly leaving. The iron beneath us is protecting us, and the iron beneath us is cooling. Both of those things are true at the same time. And the gap between them is the only reason any of this is still here. Before humans could pull iron from the ground, the only way to hold it in your hands was to find a piece of a dead world that had fallen from the sky. Think about what that means for a moment. The entire early history of iron as a material used by people was not a story of mining or smelting or metallurgy. It was a story of finding objects that had survived a journey through space and atmosphere and impact, objects that had been forged not in any furnace a human being built, but in the core of a body that no longer exists, somewhere in the solar system, at a time before Earth had finished forming. We covered how iron kills stars. We covered how it drains from the energy landscape of the universe toward its lowest point. And we established that the iron inside your blood was forged in a stellar explosion and scattered across the galaxy long before our sun existed. But there is a chapter in between that part of the story and the part where iron ends up in human hands. And that chapter is strange enough that it still catches me off guard when I think through it carefully. When small rocky bodies form in a solar system and grow large enough, the same process that happened inside early Earth happens inside them. Heavy iron sinks toward the center, a core forms. A layered structure develops, iron in the middle, silicate rock on the outside. Some of these bodies then collide with each other, and when they do, the cores get exposed. Fragments of pure metallic iron, the interior material of shattered worlds, end up drifting through space. Some of them eventually cross paths with Earth. When they hit the atmosphere, the outer surface melts and burns, but the interior, already dense and already metallic, can survive the passage and reach the ground. What lands is not ore. It is not rock with iron mixed through it in chemical compounds. It is metallic iron, already separated, already in a workable form, just sitting there on the surface of the planet. Hard, heavy, and unlike anything that could be produced by any technology available to early human cultures. The people who found these objects had no framework for understanding where they came from. They had no knowledge of solar system formation or asteroid geology or the physics of atmospheric entry. What they had was direct sensory experience of the objects themselves. The weight was wrong for any known rock. The color was wrong. When struck against other hard surfaces, the sound was different, a dense, resonant ring rather than the dull crack of stone. And when a skilled craftsman worked the material carefully, slowly, using techniques borrowed from stoneworking since the temperatures required for smelting were completely out of reach, the result was a tool or a blade with properties that had no earthly equivalent. It did not corrode the way other metals did. The nickel content, which is consistently high in meteoric iron because of how it forms in asteroid cores, changes the oxidation behavior of the material dramatically. A blade made from meteoric iron, kept reasonably dry, could stay clean and sharp for generations. To a culture where every other metal available either corroded, softened, or wore down, this was inexplicable by any natural means they had access to. So they explained it the only way available to them. It came from beyond the sky. It was different from earthly things because it was not an earthly thing. It carried properties that nothing made from the ground possessed because it was not made from the ground. Across cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and mountain ranges and centuries, the same conclusion was reached independently. This material is from somewhere else. It belongs to a different category than the things we find here. Handle it accordingly. What I find remarkable about this is not the cultural response itself. It is the accuracy of the intuition underneath it. These people were wrong about the mechanism. They did not know about asteroids or orbital mechanics or nickel content. But they were correct about the essential fact. The metal was not from Earth. It had properties that earthly materials did not possess because its origin was genuinely different from anything that formed here. The instinct that said, "This thing is other, this thing does not follow the same rules," was pointing at something real. They read the evidence correctly, even without the tools to interpret it fully. And then, everything changed. Not because someone made a discovery in the noble sense of that word, but because desperation, the same desperation that drove the transition from bronze in the first place, pushed craftsmen to experiment at the edge of what their technology could do, to push furnace temperatures higher and longer than they had before, to try things that had no guarantee of working. And at some point, someone got iron ore hot enough and kept it there long enough, and the metal came out of the ground for the first time under human direction. That moment did not feel like a triumph. The early product was inconsistent, porous in places, brittle in others, nothing like the clean, dense material that had arrived from space. It took generations of accumulated knowledge before the smelted version reliably outperformed what it was replacing. But the critical difference was availability. You could not predict when a meteorite would land. You could not choose your location based on where the sky was going to fall. But iron ore was everywhere. Once the process was understood, the supply was effectively unlimited. And that shift in availability changed the political and military structure of every society that adopted it in ways that the people involved could not have anticipated and would not have chosen if they had seen the outcome in advance. Because here is the thing about a material becoming cheap and widely available that no one talks about clearly enough. It does not just change what things are made of, it changes who has access to power. And when power changes hands at the scale that iron made possible, the world that existed before does not come back. The Bronze Age had natural limits on how far violence could scale. The raw materials were rare enough, the craft specialized enough, that there was a ceiling on how many people could be effectively equipped at once. Iron removed that ceiling. Not immediately, not in the first generation of smelting, but steadily as the techniques improved and the cost dropped, and the ore proved to be essentially inexhaustible in most regions. Armies that had previously been constrained by the availability of quality metal could now be equipped with functional weapons by the thousands. What followed was not an age of stability and prosperity built on better tools. It was an age of conflict at a scale that the Bronze world had never seen, because the Bronze world had never had the material capacity to sustain it. Entire landscapes were cleared of forest to feed the furnaces. Communities were reorganized around the production of metal. Trade in raw ore replaced trade in finished bronze, and the political structures built around controlling those ore deposits looked nothing like what had come before. We look back at this transition and call it progress. We put it in the textbooks as a chapter in the story of human advancement. And in some narrow technical sense, the material that came out of it was more versatile and eventually more capable than what it replaced. But the lived experience of the people who went through it, the communities disrupted, the forests burned, the conflicts that became possible for the first time at that scale, that is a different story than the one the word progress usually tells. And the infrastructure built during that transition, the patterns of mining, smelting, distributing and deploying iron that developed across those early centuries, did not stay in the past. It evolved. It scaled. It became the industrial framework that the modern world runs on. 95% of all metal produced by humanity today is iron and its alloys. The supply chain logic, the political economy of who controls the ore and who controls the furnaces, the relationship between metal production and military capacity, all of it traces a direct line back to those first desperate experiments with furnace temperatures and ore. We did not escape the Iron Age, we deepened it. We built a civilization so thoroughly organized around this one element that removing it from the picture would not leave a simpler version of the world we have. It would leave nothing recognizable at all. But here is what that means in thermodynamic terms. Every ton of steel in every building and bridge and vehicle on Earth is iron that has been forcibly separated from the oxygen it naturally bonds with, held in an artificial metallic state by the energy we put into refining it. And iron, as we have established, does not simply accept that situation. It does not stay in the state we put it in out of any cooperation with our plans. It pulls, constantly and without pause, back toward the oxygen it was separated from. And the scale of resources we spend fighting that pull is something that most people have never had reason to stop and calculate. Every structure humanity has ever built is in the process of destroying itself, and we are spending more money trying to slow that process than we spend on most things we consider genuinely important. Not eventually, right now. Actively. The steel inside the concrete walls of the building nearest to you is corroding at this moment, molecule by molecule, pulling oxygen from the surrounding moisture and converting itself back into the oxide state it started in before anyone ever put energy into refining it. The process is slow enough that we generally do not notice it on a human timescale. But the bills it generates are staggering. Estimates across different studies consistently place the annual global cost of corrosion somewhere around 4% of gross world product. 4% of everything the entire human economy produces every year, just to manage the consequences of iron trying to return to its natural state. To put that in a way that lands properly, that figure exceeds the total economic output of most countries on Earth. It is more than the world spends annually on space exploration by several orders of magnitude. It is more than the combined research budgets of most scientific fields. And it is not building anything. It is not advancing anything. It is purely the cost of maintenance, the ongoing tax that thermodynamics charges for the privilege of keeping iron in a form it does not want to be in. And the unsettling part is not the cost. The cost is just money. The unsettling part is what happens when the cost does not get paid. Because corrosion is not a uniform process that degrades everything at the same rate and gives you a predictable schedule to work with. It concentrates. It hides. It finds the places where the protective coating has a microscopic gap, or where two different metals are in contact and create an electrochemical cell, or where the concrete cover over a steel rebar has cracked just enough to let moisture through. It works in those hidden places, invisibly, for years or decades, and the structure above it continues to carry its load as if nothing is happening, because from the outside, nothing appears to be. Until the day the load becomes too much for what remains. Think about what that actually means for the infrastructure around you. The bridge you drive over, the elevated highway, the parking structure, the water pipes under the road. All of these were built with a design life, an engineering estimate of how long the structure should remain safe, assuming proper maintenance. But maintenance schedules assume inspections, and inspections assume access, and access assumes someone is paying attention and has the budget and the time. In practice, large portions of critical infrastructure in developed countries are operating significantly beyond their design life, maintained on schedules that would have been considered inadequate even at the time of construction, inspected at intervals that were set when the structures were new and the assumptions about degradation rates were optimistic. Iron does not care about budget cycles or inspection schedules. It does not pause its work while the funding debate continues. It keeps converting, keeps oxidizing, keeps pulling the crystal structure of the steel apart one reaction at a time, patient in the way that only a chemical process can be patient, which is to say without any patience at all, simply continuous. The real lesson here is not about infrastructure policy or engineering standards. It is about the fundamental nature of the relationship between human civilization and this element. We did not build on stable ground. We built on borrowed time, using a material that is in constant, active disagreement with the form we gave it. Every city on Earth is a temporary arrangement, not in the abstract philosophical sense that everything changes eventually, but in the concrete physical sense that the primary structural material holding it together is chemically motivated to come apart. And the only thing preventing that is continuous expenditure of energy and resources and attention. Remove the maintenance, and the timeline becomes visible. There are abandoned industrial sites where buildings from the early part of the last century have been left without any protective intervention for decades. What you see there is not gradual aging in the way an old wooden building ages, with a certain dignified weathering. What you see is aggressive structural dissolution. Beams that were carrying significant loads have thinned to a fraction of their original cross-section. Roof structures have collapsed not from any dramatic event, but simply from the progressive loss of material to oxidation. The color of the place is uniform, the deep reddish-brown of iron oxide, as if the whole structure is slowly bleeding out into the air around it. That color is the same color as Mars, the same color as old blood, the same color as the soil in regions with high iron content. It is the color of iron returning to its preferred chemical state, and it is the most honest visual record available of what iron actually wants to do with the form we gave it. Now here is where this connects to something much larger. Because what we just described, iron resisting the metallic state and converting back to oxide, is a local, human-scale version of a universal process. The thermodynamic pull that makes steel corrode is the same pull that makes the universe trend toward iron in the first place. The direction is the same. The mechanism is the same. Only the scale is different. And quantum mechanics has something to add to this picture that most people have never heard, because it is genuinely difficult to explain without making it sound like science fiction, and because the timescales involved are so far outside ordinary experience that the brain tends to reject them as meaningless. But they are not meaningless. They are the most consequential numbers in the long-term physics of existence. There is a quantum mechanical process called tunneling. You may have heard the name in passing without ever having the full picture explained. Here is what it actually means. In classical physics, if a particle does not have enough energy to cross a barrier, it cannot cross the barrier. It stays on its side. End of story. But quantum mechanics describes particles not as objects with a fixed location, but as probability distributions smeared across space in ways that classical intuition cannot accommodate. And a probability distribution that is centered on one side of a barrier has a small but non-zero component on the other side of the barrier, always. Which means there is always a small but non-zero probability that the particle will be found on the other side without having crossed in any classical sense. It simply appears there. The barrier did not stop it. The barrier slowed the probability. For everyday chemistry, this effect is negligible. The probabilities involved for large-scale processes are so vanishingly small that they never produce observable outcomes on any timescale that matters to anything alive. But here is the critical word. Never, in physics, almost always means not within any timescale we currently care about. Push the timescale far enough, and never becomes eventually. And the timescale relevant to what tunneling does to atomic nuclei is not millions of years, it is not billions of years. It is not even the current age of the universe multiplied by 1 billion. The numbers involved are so large that expressing them in standard notation requires exponents that most calculators cannot display without switching to scientific format. But the process they describe is real. It follows from established quantum mechanics, and its outcome is the same outcome we have been building toward this entire time. Given a long enough wait, every atomic nucleus in existence has a calculable probability of restructuring itself into a lower energy configuration. Carbon nuclei can tunnel toward iron. Oxygen nuclei can tunnel toward iron. Gold, platinum, calcium, silicon, the nitrogen in the air, the calcium in your bones, every element sitting uphill from iron on that nuclear binding energy landscape we described earlier, all of it has a non-zero probability of converting to iron without any external input of energy. No furnace, no stellar core, no supernova. Just time and probability, doing arithmetic in the dark. The gold in whatever jewelry you own right now is, in the most technically accurate sense available to physics, iron that has not finished its conversion yet. It is sitting at an elevated energy state, held there not by any active force, but simply by the improbability of the tunneling event that would move it downhill. The improbability is enormous. The weight required is incomprehensible, but the direction is fixed. The destination is fixed. And this means the universe has an endpoint written into its physics at the most fundamental level. An endpoint that does not require any dramatic event, no collision, no explosion, no external intervention. Just the quiet, continuous, unstoppable work of quantum probability converting everything that exists into the one configuration that needs no further conversion. What that endpoint actually looks like, what the universe becomes when that process completes, is something that theoretical physicists have modeled in detail. And the picture they arrive at is so strange, so total, and so permanent that it changes the way every other fact in this story sits in your mind once you see it clearly. The universe already knows exactly what it is going to look like at the end, and the picture is so specific, so detailed, and so permanent that physicists have given it a name. We left off with quantum tunneling, with the idea that every atom in existence is slowly, imperceptibly, inevitably converting toward iron through a process that requires no heat, no pressure, no external event of any kind. Just probability, working in silence, across timescales that make the current age of the universe look like the first frame of a film that runs for longer than any human concept of duration can contain. Now I want to take that idea and follow it all the way to its conclusion, because the endpoint it produces is not vague. It is not some abstract notion of things running down. It is a specific physical state, and understanding it changes the weight of everything we have talked about up to this point. Start by running the clock forward past the point where the last stars burn out. All the hydrogen in the universe eventually gets consumed or dispersed beyond reach. The galaxies darken. The stellar nurseries go quiet. The last red dwarfs, the smallest and most fuel-efficient stars, burn for trillions of years, but they burn out too. One by one, every light in the universe goes cold. The background temperature of space, already close to absolute zero, drops fractionally lower with each extinction. What remains after the stars are gone is a population of cold remnants. Neutron stars, white dwarfs, black holes, and the frozen husks of planets and moons drifting in the dark, separated by distances so vast that they will never interact again in any meaningful way. The universe at this point is not dramatic. It is not violent or loud or even particularly interesting. It is just very cold and very empty and very dark. And the processes still running inside it are too slow for any observer to witness, assuming any observer still existed, which nothing does. The black holes persist for a while longer. Through a mechanism that was worked out theoretically decades ago, black holes slowly lose mass by radiating energy at a rate inversely proportional to their size. The larger the black hole, the slower the process. The largest ones, the supermassive black holes that sat at the centers of galaxies, take an almost incomprehensible time to complete this evaporation. But they do complete it. Every single one of them. The process is slow, but it has no floor, no minimum rate below which it stops. It runs until the mass is gone, ending in a brief final burst of radiation, and then nothing. After the last black hole evaporates, the universe contains no objects capable of any significant energy release. No stars, no active galactic nuclei, no neutron star collisions, no supernovae. Just the cold remnants and the expanding darkness and the quantum tunneling, still running, still converting, still moving every atomic nucleus fractionally closer to iron with every moment that passes. And here is what the universe looks like when that process reaches completion. Scattered across an expanse of space so vast that the word vast completely fails to convey it, separated from each other by distances that light would take longer than the current age of the universe to cross, are spheres. Perfectly smooth, perfectly cold. Each one is composed entirely of iron-56, the most stable nuclear configuration that physics permits. They range in size from small rocky bodies to objects as large as former stars. They emit no light, no heat, no radiation of any kind. Nothing is happening inside them. No reactions, no phase transitions, no movement at any scale. The temperature of their surfaces is indistinguishable from the temperature of the space around them, which is as close to absolute zero as physics allows. These are the iron stars, not stars in any active sense. That name is a kind of dark irony, a label attached to objects that represent the complete absence of everything that makes a star what it is. They are the final form of all matter. Every atom that was ever part of a living cell, every nucleus that was ever part of a star, every proton that was ever part of anything, has been incorporated into one of these cold spheres. The diversity of the periodic table, all the elements we named and studied and built our world from, has been resolved into a single entry. Iron. Just iron, everywhere, forever, in the dark. No events occur. There is nothing left that could constitute an event. Time continues to pass in the sense that the mathematical framework of physics still operates. But nothing marks its passage. Nothing changes. Nothing decays further. Nothing interacts. The universe has reached the state of lowest possible energy and lowest possible information, and it will remain in that state for a duration that has no upper bound. This is what physicists call the iron star era. And it is not a hypothesis. It is the direct mathematical consequence of the physics we confirmed in laboratories and particle accelerators and astronomical observations. The same quantum mechanics that describes the behavior of electrons in your phone's processor also describes the tunneling that converts matter to iron on these timescales. The same thermodynamics that explains why your car rusts explains why the universe trends toward this endpoint. It is all the same physics, operating across different scales. Now hold all of that. Hold the image of those cold iron spheres drifting in permanent silence, carrying within their crystal structure the converted remains of ever existed or happened or mattered in the universe. Hold it clearly. And then notice something about it that I think is the most important thing in this entire story. An iron star does not know it is an iron star. That sounds obvious. Of course it does not know. It is a cold metal sphere with no internal activity whatsoever. But the implication of that obvious fact is not obvious at all, and following it leads somewhere that changes the way the whole picture sits in your mind. Everything that ever had awareness, every organism that ever processed information about its environment, every brain that ever held a thought or a memory or a question, existed in the narrow window between the beginning of chemistry complex enough to support life and the end of conditions hospitable to that chemistry. That window, compared to the total duration of the universe, including the iron star era, is so brief that expressing it as a fraction produces a number smaller than any fraction that has ever been relevant to anything in human history. We are inside that window right now. You are inside it right now, listening to this. And the iron star era is not coming for you personally, not for your lifetime or your children's lifetimes, or any number of human generations that it is practically useful to think about. But it is coming. The physics is running. The direction is fixed, and every atom in your body is already, in the most technical sense available, iron that has not finished converting yet. What does that make you? What does that make this moment? What does it make any moment of awareness, of curiosity, of a mind reaching out to understand what it is made of and where it came from? Here is what I think it means. The universe did not produce awareness as a central feature. It produced it as a side effect, a temporary and local consequence of the chemistry that emerges during the middle phase of universal cooling. By the time the iron stars form, there will be nothing left that can look at them and understand them. There will be nothing left that can wonder what they are or how they got there or what existed before them. The capacity for that kind of wondering, the thing you are doing right now, is not the final state of the universe. It is an early and fleeting anomaly in a process whose final state is featureless and silent. The iron in your blood came from a star that had no awareness of its own existence. It will eventually, over timescales that defeat imagination, become part of a cold sphere that also has no awareness of its existence. In between those two states, for a duration that is genuinely negligible in the context of total universal time, it passed through a phase where it was part of something that could think. Something that could sit with a handful of coins and notice a smell and follow that observation all the way down through biology and history and astrophysics to the end of everything. That phase is now. You are that phase. The fact that you can understand the Iron Star era is precisely what makes you different from the Iron Star era. And the gap between understanding something and being that something is the only gap in the universe that actually matters. The moral of this entire story is simple, but it hits hard. We spend our lives treating the present moment as a waiting room for something more important that is coming later. We treat awareness as a default, as a background condition that does not need to be accounted for. But the physics says something different. It says that awareness is the exception, not the rule. It says that the universe's natural state is cold and silent and without witness, and that what we have right now, this specific, unrepeatable, cosmically brief arrangement of matter that can look at itself and ask questions, is not the beginning of something permanent. It is the most extraordinary detour in a process that was always heading somewhere else. The iron was always going to win, but it has not won yet. And in the time between now and when it does, something exists that the iron stars never will, something that knows the difference. So here is the question I want you to sit with and answer in the comments below. If you knew with absolute certainty that awareness is temporary, that the universe is heading toward a final state where nothing thinks or feels or wonders, would that make the way you spend your time feel different to you? Would it change anything about today? Would knowing that this moment is genuinely irreplaceable, not as a motivational phrase, but as a physical fact, actually move you? Or does the scale of it make it feel too abstract to land? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know where your mind goes with this. And if this video shifted something in the way you think, even slightly, hit the like button and subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from, and the next one goes somewhere you will not expect.